all you literary legends and luminaries. Today's episode is on one of my favorite topics, Little House on the Prairie. The book I will primarily discuss, the one I just read, is John E. Miller's Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little Town, where history and literature meet. But I'm going to supplement it with what I call the Little House on the Prairie Bible, Laura Ingalls Wilder's Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography. First, let's start with Miller's book. What made me snatch the book from my used bookstore shelf was the subtitle, Where History and Literature Meet. If you don't know already, I teach English, well, technically everything but math, at a juvenile detention center. I also taught for over a decade at community colleges. My philosophy of teaching literature is this: every single book you read is a representation of the times in which it was written. I drive this issue into my students' heads, especially when we are reading books that display offensive behavior towards people of color, women, or any disenfranchised group. Even when I teach Romeo and Juliet, I make sure my students understand the limits of medicine at the time, that even 200 years later, during Edgar Allan Poe's writing career, people were buried alive by accident. Such historical details are crucial to understanding any story. My students complain at how boring Pride and Prejudice is, and I ask them, what do you expect Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy to do? Text each other? I'm still not sure they fully understand that the world we know today is not how things used to operate. I tell them horror stories about my teenage years of literally waiting by the phone in case a boy called. They struggle to understand anything outside of their world, which, in my humble opinion, is also a problem for adults, which sometimes explains why we are living in such a polarized society right now. But that's a topic for another day. The point I'm making, that Miller appeared to promise in his Little Town book, is that Laura Ingalls Wilder's books will teach us about the world in which she lived, thereby giving us a history lesson while we read fiction. And yes, Miller even tells us that her precious books are fiction, which is another reason his book intrigued me. I remember those days in the 80s with the hoity-toity Wilder book followers who were disgusted by the TV show because the show did not stick to the truth like the books. But if you know Laura's life well enough, you know that the books are not the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. I just get so passionate and wound up about all things Little House on the Prairie. First, I want to show you the title page because I just love it. It says, to Evelyn, enjoy your visit with Laura Ingalls Wilder. I'd like to know who Evelyn is and what she thought of her visit with Laura. This is another reason I love to use books. I adore the personal scribbles and names and messages that appear in them. Now, this is important in understanding where Miller was coming from and how he wrote this book. He published Little Town in 1994. So while the internet did exist in 1994, people weren't readily using it for research or much of anything. When I started college in 1995, a couple of years later, the education department was bragging about how the scholarly journals in education were now available through an online database, something sounding so foreign at the time. So Miller's book does not contain information that nowadays we can find within seconds or within minutes if you're searching for credible sources. I found myself yelling at Miller in a few places because his information was not up to date, but that isn't his fault. Let me read you what Miller wrote in the introduction as he is setting up the premise of his book. The chapters included in this book are exploratory and not intended to provide a comprehensive interpretation of Laura Ingalls Wilder's work, but they touch on many themes that I consider to be central to it. Running through all of them is the question of the relationship between history and literature. My intention is to illustrate how history nourishes literature and how literature, in turn, informs us about history. In the process of writing her novels, Wilder discovered that she was also writing history. They shed light on what Lionel Trilling said novels are designed to illuminate: the look and feel of things, how things are done and what things are worth and what they cost and what the odds are. The novel, Trilling asserted, is a perpetual quest for reality, the field of its research being always the social world. It is that social reality and Wilder's way of seeing it and depicting it that constitute the primary focus of this book. Notice Miller uses the word novel, which equates to fiction, unless you're Truman Capote and trying to start a new genre with the nonfiction novel. Miller's chapters operate more like essays, with some essays having been previously published in Midwestern journals. With all I know about Laura Ingalls Wilder, Miller still manages to teach me some new stuff, or at least focus on areas that maybe I glossed over. When he's describing the blossoming relationship between El Manzo, and it is El Manzo, not El Manzo like the show pronounces it, he says that Laura at times seemed more interested in his horses than in El Manzo. He also deadpanly states what Laura thought of teaching. Nothing appealed to her less than teaching school, but because she realized it was the best and practically only way she could earn money to help send Mary to college, she reluctantly did. I giggled at that. Miller spends some time developing how Laura and her daughter Rose created her books, how she made narrative choices that sometimes deterred away from the hardcore facts. And a side note on Rose, Miller doesn't appear to buy into the conspiracy theory that Rose was the one doing all the writing. Let me read you this, how Miller describes how Laura wrote about Ma. Laura frequently contrasted her own personality with that of Mary, whom she identified with her mother in her conventionality, conservative approach to life. Caution is necessary in drawing these conclusions because Laura exaggerated and simplified events and characters in order to enhance the narrative. The messy complications of everyday life that contribute to its complexity and paradox were frequently forgotten or transmuted in composing the books. A good example of this is the episode where Laura begs Ma to let her help Pa with haying in the fields. In real life, her mother sometimes actually joined in the work herself, but in her daughter's fictionalized accounts, Ma was cast in the traditional role of a native-born middle-class white woman who was disturbed by the idea of women working in the fields. Likewise, Laura's fictional aversion to sewing, a ladylike activity, belies the fact that in real life, she enjoyed the occupation. This is one thing I think Little House on the Prairie TV show does a better job at revealing sometimes, that Carolyn was as smart and almost as strong as any man. Remember all those times when Charles can't work for one reason or another, the broken ribs, or when he leaves all the time to find work? Carolyn does all the work at home, including the manly chores. Miller also provides some insight into the role of history in schools and literature, which is relevant in our world today, considering many states are having meltdowns over how and what is part of the social studies curriculum. Instead of summarizing it, I'm going to read you how Miller condenses an incredibly complicated issue, and he does so beautifully. Much can be inferred from this episode about the history instruction of the time. It was nationalistic, patriotic, and didactic. The past pointed to the present and reached toward the future, explaining the high degree of progress and perfection that the nation had achieved. It was also conventional and elitist. Politics, as highlighted by presidential administrations, provided a framework for pigeonholing historical facts and focusing students' attention. Presidents, generals, explorers, and other great leaders acted as the crucial determinants of history, while pioneers, workers, and farmers played out the minor roles that were assigned to them, receiving little attention. History was sequential. It moved. Understanding history required putting facts into chronological order and observing how one development necessarily led to another. To know history, therefore, was to know what these facts were. To demonstrate one's knowledge, a person recited them. Thus, if one could memorize everything and avoid any mistakes, one would know history. The central and usually only tool for learning, that is memorizing, this type of history was the textbook. Since there were few well-qualified teachers on the frontier, reliance on the textbook was not entirely a bad thing. Studies that have been done of history textbooks used during the post-Civil War period note that they lean toward a didactic, sequential, fact-based, moralistic approach. Along with other subjects in the curriculum, history was supposed to be more than an intellectual exercise. It had important lessons to teach. Little children, admonished the author of a selection in a reader published in 1882, you must seek rather to be good than wise. History, for its part, could engender patriotism, teach the virtues of hard work, persistence, honesty, and sobriety, and offer role models to help build character in young people. So think about those three words that Miller used: nationalistic, patriotic, and didactic. I wonder what three adjectives we would use to describe the role of history in schools today, and if those are what has everyone all upset. Which sort of leads me into a criticism of Miller's book. I was hoping he would tackle the way Native Americans were depicted in Wilder's books, but he glosses over it, rationalizing that Laura herself as a child and a teenager wouldn't have understood such conflicting issues like politics and racism, so she didn't write about them in her books. I think that's a cop-out. A reader wrote to Wilder about a horrible racist remark in one of her books, which she then removed from subsequent printings. I think Miller didn't want to get into it, which he shouldn't have avoided it. When Wilder grew up, and even when she wrote her book, society was not the least bit interested in being politically correct. Shoot, society didn't even care about being nice and polite, just as a rule. So I give Miller an F for avoiding tackling such an issue, especially with today's issues at hand, and that Laura no longer has her Children's Award for literature. It was renamed. Miller contends that storytelling came naturally to Laura, that she probably inherited such creative storytelling from Pa, but he never develops any of Pa's exaggerating details and such. Miller even brings up the infamous Bender murders, which we know the Ingalls had absolutely nothing to do with and were not even in the area at the time, despite the tall tales Charles liked to tell. Miller doesn't quite bring the whole fiction stems from nonfiction, but it's still fiction issue. Both Laura and Rose swore up and down that absolutely everything in the book is absolutely 100% true, much like the fanatical book fans who turn their nose down at Little House on the Prairie, the TV show. Let me read you an incident that Miller describes when Laura was called out on some of the veracity of her books. Wilder emphasized that she did not invent her stories. They were true. They were factual. In corresponding with Lane about By the Shores of Silver Lake, for instance, she tried to explain how girls' behavior in her own day had been more demure, reserved, and innocent than it had become by the 1930s. This is a true story, Wilder said of her description of life in the 1880s, and supposed they had a different, almost civilization. In later years, Lane vehemently defended the factual accuracy of her mother's books. She demanded that William Anderson modify a statement in the story of the Ingalls in which he said that the Ingalls family had had several neighbors in the vicinity during their first winter in Dakota Territory. This statement implied, Lane fumed, that her mother was a liar. You will please correct your proposed publication to accord with my mother's statement in her books, she wrote Anderson. I cannot permit publication of a slander of my mother's character, and I shall not do so. To Lane, the question of factual accuracy was crucial. The book's value and her mother's reputation depended on it. My mother's repeated and emphatic claim that her books are true stories, plus the fact that records exist to verify that claim, give her a strong motive for accuracy, she told Anderson. Mr. Sherwood and Mr. Bose, merely repeating hearsay, no doubt believe their statements to be true, but have nothing to lose if they are mistaken about a date. Why should they work for accuracy? If my mother's books are not absolutely accurate, she will be discredited as a person and a writer. That's a lot to take in. I do credit Laura and Rose for wanting to get the little details straight, for double-checking dates and whatnot. Yet Miller doesn't quite bring this paradox to a close. Rose might have wanted to believe it, but her mother surely knew differently. Also, Miller never brings up Rose's outright lying when she wrote biographies on Jack London and Charlie Chaplin and how those families wanted to sue her for all that she fictionalized. But in 1994, Miller did a decent job of putting together details that might not have been readily accessible to the average person. Miller primarily focuses on De Smet, South Dakota, since that is where Laura spent a large portion of her childhood, and many of her books take place within the area. Yes, some of the chapters are boring, especially the details about the opera house and such, but part of me thinks such topics are necessary. I've never lived in a small town, but my parents grew up in a small town where my grandparents remained, so as a child, I knew the difference in small town living versus big city living. Every time we visited, we made the newspaper because the small town newspaper had nothing better to report than on out-of-town visitors. And Elsa, our beloved Norwegian elkhound, won Best in Show in a dog show there during one of their summer festivals. I don't know if the general public understands small-town living, so I commend Miller for writing such a book and covering topics like freedom and independence and love and how community shapes us. It does get repetitive at times, which can be a bit irritating. However, if you are looking for specific details on how Laura's life made it into her children's book and all the historical facts surrounding her lifetime, you have to read Pioneer Girl. If you are a Little House on the Prairie fan, books or TV show, shame on you if you haven't read this. It's full of details, like a pop-up video version with all these little factoids in the margin. I would recommend this reading, but don't read it like a normal book. It's best read slowly and in small chunks at a time. The South Dakota State Historical Society created the Pioneer Girl Project, which brought a whole bunch of prairie fans together who did countless hours of research. And in the margins, you'll see, these are the margins. there's more stuff in the margin than actually in the story. You'll see how Pioneer Girl connects to all the Little House books, the land, the towns, historical facts, and flowers, and grasses, and trees. It is thorough. There's even a whole part that deals with the SMED and much better city maps in Millertown. And I trust wholeheartedly Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, before I would trust any bit of information found on the internet. I know the extensive research that went behind the book and the publishing and editing process it went through. If you are a Laura Ingalls Wilder fan or a Little House on the Prairie fan, you have to own Pioneer Girl, but probably not Miller's book. I only wish the annotated autobiography brought up the show and how that presented factual incidents and such, but all those involved with the project probably held contempt for the show. Maybe I should write the annotated bibliography of Little House on the Prairie, what the show depicted accurately. I keep coming up with more projects. This is not the last time I will discuss Little House on the Prairie here at Booksmart. I have 2 more books in my to-read cabinet and 3 books about Laura that were good enough to keep. I could probably make a separate Booksmart YouTube channel all about Little House on the Prairie. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.